The first stone Caleb Brennan carried up that ridge weighed 30 pounds and nearly broke his back, but he promised her walls, and a mountain man kept his word even when the woman barely knew his name yet. Montana Territory stretched wild and unforgiving in the summer of 1877, a landscape carved by ancient glaciers and polished by relentless wind. The settlement of Copper Creek huddled in the valley below, a collection of rough timber buildings and canvas tents where prospectors and settlers tried to carve civilization from wilderness. Caleb had wandered into town 3 weeks prior, a solitary figure leading a pack mule loaded with beaver pelts and elk hides, his shoulders broad enough to block doorways and his hair hanging past his collar in dark waves that caught the light like crow feathers. He stood well over 6 feet. His frame wrapped in muscle built from years hauling traps through mountain passes and wrestling rapids for beaver dams. His hands were scarred and capable, the kind of hands that could snap a man's wrist or cradle an injured sparrow with equal ease. He had not come to Copper Creek looking for anything except supplies and maybe a hot meal that he had not cooked himself over a pine fire. What he found instead was Eleanor Hartwell standing outside the general store with her face set in lines of barely controlled desperation, and her eyes the color of creek water in spring, gray-green, and impossible to look away from. She was trying to negotiate the price of lumber with a merchant who clearly saw her predicament and intended to profit from it. "Ma'am, I am telling you what I already told you yesterday," the merchant said. His thumbs hooked in his vest pockets, stomach protruding over his belt. "Lumber is scarce this season. Everyone is building. Everyone needs it. Price is what it is." Eleanor stood straight, despite the obvious weight pressing on her shoulders. She was perhaps 22 or 23, slender in the way of someone who worked hard and ate sparingly, her auburn hair pinned back in a practical bun that still managed to catch fire in the afternoon sun. She wore a simple calico dress that had been mended more than once, and her hands clutched a small leather purse that clearly did not contain enough money for what she needed. "I understand the market pressures, Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice steady even though Caleb could see her knuckles white around that purse. "But surely we can reach some accommodation. I have a claim 4 miles north, up the ridge. My father filed it before he passed. The cabin there burned last month during the dry lightning storms. I need to rebuild before winter, and I need materials to do it." Thornton shrugged with theatrical sympathy. "Terrible tragedy, truly. But business is business. You want lumber at my price, I will sell it to you. You want credit, well, I would need collateral I do not see you offering." Caleb had been loading his mule with flour sacks and coffee, not intending to involve himself in local disputes. He had learned long ago that settlements brought complications, and complications were why he preferred the high country where the only negotiations were between himself and the weather. But something about the set of Eleanor's jaw, the way she refused to let defeat show even when it was clearly whispering in her ear, made him pause with a 50-pound sack balanced on one shoulder. "What about stone?" he heard himself say, his voice rough from days of not using it except to talk to his mule. Both Eleanor and Thornton turned to look at him. Up close, Caleb could see the fine lines of exhaustion around Eleanor's eyes, the smudge of ash still on her sleeve that suggested she had been sorting through the ruins of her cabin that very morning. She studied him with an expression caught between hope and wariness, as if strangers offering help were things to be questioned rather than accepted. "I am sorry," Eleanor said. Caleb set down the flour sack and stepped closer, aware that he probably smelled like wood smoke and horse, that his buckskin shirt was stained and worn. "Me, stone walls. Ridge like that, 4 miles north, I know the area. Good granite all through those slopes. You do not need lumber if you build with stone. Warmer in winter, cooler in summer, and it will not burn." Thornton snorted. "You planning to build her a castle, mountain man? Stone walls take time and skill." "I have both," Caleb said simply, his pale blue eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. "I'm offering to do it, if the lady wants." Eleanor looked at him as if he had just offered her the moon pulled down from the sky. "You don't even know me. Why would you offer such a thing?" It was a fair question, and Caleb was not entirely sure of the answer himself. Perhaps it was because he had seen too many people crushed by this territory, good people who deserved better than to be ground down by circumstance and predatory merchants. Perhaps it was the way she stood there refusing to beg even when begging might have served her better. Or perhaps it was something simpler and more dangerous, the recognition that sometimes a man met a woman and knew, in some deep and wordless place, that his life had just pivoted on an axis he had not known existed. "I am not doing anything else this summer," he said, which was not quite a lie, but not quite the truth either. "And I know these mountains. You are not going to make it through winter in a tent or a lean-to. You need proper shelter, and Stone will give you that." Eleanor's eyes searched his face, looking for the trap, the angle, the price that would come due. Caleb let her look. He had nothing to hide except perhaps the sudden fierce certainty that he would build her walls even if she said no. Would haul Stone up that ridge until his back broke, because something in him recognized something in her, a matching stubborn refusal to surrender. "I cannot pay you," Eleanor said finally, the words clearly costing her. "Not in money. I have the claim and I have some supplies, but I am not wealthy. I am barely surviving." "Did not ask for pay," Caleb said. "Asked if you wanted walls." Thornton made a dismissive sound and waved his hand. "This is foolishness. Girl needs proper lumber and a proper house, not some rock pile built by a trapper who will probably disappear come first snow." Caleb turned his gaze to Thornton, and whatever the merchant saw in that look made him step back and close his mouth. Caleb was not a violent man by preference, but he had lived in places where violence was sometimes the only language spoken, and he knew how to make himself understood without saying a word. "I will build the walls," Caleb said, still looking at Thornton but speaking to Eleanor. "Stone foundation, stone walls, timber roof if we can get it, or sod if we cannot. It will stand 100 years, and I will not disappear." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and Caleb could almost hear her thinking, weighing risks against necessity, pride against pragmatism. Finally she turned to him and extended her hand, slim fingers emerging from the cuff of her mended dress. "My name is Eleanor Hartwell. If you are serious about this offer, then I accept with gratitude. I can provide meals and whatever help I am able to give. I am stronger than I look." Caleb took her hand, felt the calluses there that matched his own, the grip that was firm despite the delicacy of her bones. Her hand was warm and alive in his, and he felt something shift in his chest, a lock tumbling open that he had not known was closed. "Caleb Brennan, I'm serious. I will ride up tomorrow and survey the site." He released her hand reluctantly and watched as she nodded, then gathered her skirts and walked away with her spine straight and her head high, even though she had just accepted charity from a stranger and probably hated every moment of needing to. Caleb watched her go, watched the sunlight catch in that auburn hair, and knew with absolute certainty that his life had just become vastly more complicated. Thornton spat in the dust. "You are a fool, Brennan. Girl like that, alone up on a claim, you know what people will say about you spending time up there. Besides, she probably cannot even cook." Caleb turned back to his mule and hefted the flour sack into place, securing it with practiced efficiency. "People can say what they want, and I can cook fine myself." He finished loading his supplies and led the mule out of town, but his mind was already 4 miles north, already calculating the best routes to haul stone, already seeing the walls rising from that ridge like something that had always been meant to exist. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of mountain morning where the air tasted like ice even in July. Caleb packed his tools, loaded his mule with water and supplies, and rode north along the trail that climbed steadily toward the higher elevations. The forest here was dense with lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, the undergrowth thick with huckleberry bushes heavy with fruit. But he saw a deer sign and bear scat, noted the scratch marks on trees where a grizzly had marked territory. This was wild country, the kind that did not forgive mistakes or tolerate weakness. Eleanor's claim sat on a ridge that overlooked the valley, a natural plateau carved into the mountainside where some ancient landslide had created a relatively flat expanse of perhaps 2 acres. The view was staggering, mountains marching away in every direction, the valley below a green ribbon threaded with silver where Copper Creek twisted through the grassland. It was also exposed to every wind that blew down from Canada and would be buried in snow 8 months of the year. The ruins of the old cabin sat near the center of the plateau, a blackened skeleton of timber and a stone chimney that had survived the fire. Caleb dismounted and walked through the ashes, reading the story written there. The cabin had been small, perhaps 12 by 14 feet, with a single room and that chimney for heat and cooking. It had burned hot and fast, probably in the middle of the night when lightning struck during a summer storm. Eleanor had been fortunate to escape with her life. She emerged from a canvas tent pitched near the tree line, and Caleb realized she'd been watching him approach. She wore the same mended dress but had added a man's wool coat against the morning chill, sleeves rolled up to accommodate arms too long for her frame. Her hair was in a braid today, hanging over one shoulder, and she carried a tin cup that steamed in the cold air. "Coffee?" she offered. "It is not much, but it is hot." Caleb accepted the cup and sipped, but tasting coffee stretched thin with chicory, but boiled strong enough to wake the dead. It was terrible and wonderful at the same time, and he said so, which made Eleanor smile for the first time since he had met her. "My father used to say that coffee should be strong enough to float a horseshoe. I have tried to maintain his standards." "Your father taught you well." Caleb handed back the cup and turned to survey the site with a professional eye. "How long ago did he pass?" 4 months. Fever took him in March. It was fast, which I suppose was a mercy. Eleanor's voice was steady, but Caleb heard the grief beneath the words, still fresh and sharp. "He filed this claim 2 years ago, brought me out from Ohio. My mother had died the year before, and he wanted a fresh start. Wanted to build something that would last." Caleb walked the perimeter of the burned cabin, then moved outward in widening circles, studying the terrain and the available resources. The ridge was granite, as he had suspected, with massive outcroppings breaking through the thin soil like bones through skin. There was good stone here, plenty of it, and gravity would help with some of the hauling if he was clever about the routes. "Your father chose well," Caleb said, crouching to examine a section of exposed bedrock. "This granite is solid. We can quarry what we need right here, no need to bring stone from elsewhere. And the chimney foundation is still good, so we can incorporate that into the new structure." Eleanor joined him, standing close enough that he could smell soap and wood smoke, clean scents that cut through the ash and char. I have been thinking about just rebuilding the cabin as it was, same size, same design. I know it worked because my father and I lived in it for nearly 2 years." Caleb stood and faced her, and he saw the moment she registered his full size, the way she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. He was careful to keep his posture non-threatening, aware that she was alone up here with a man she barely knew, aware of all the ways that vulnerability could be exploited. "We can build it any way you want," he said carefully. "But since we are building with stone instead of timber, we have some advantages. Stone walls should be thick, at least 18 inches, which means we can make the interior space a bit larger without worrying about structural integrity. And we can build higher if you want, maybe add a sleeping loft. Not more space to store supplies, maybe room for a workshop or storage area?" Eleanor bit her lip, thinking, and Caleb found himself watching her mouth, the way her teeth caught the full lower lip, the small furrow between her brows that deepened when she concentrated. "I would like that," she said slowly. "Space to think, to move around without bumping into everything. My father and I managed, but it was cramped, especially during the winter months when we were inside for days at a time." She paused, then added with a wry smile, "Of course, now it is just me, so perhaps cramped is relative." "Room to grow," Caleb said, then felt heat rise in his face because that sounded presumptuous, as if he was assuming she would not always be alone, as if he was suggesting possibilities that had no business being suggested by a stranger who had known her less than a day. But Eleanor just nodded thoughtfully, as if he had said something perfectly reasonable. "Yes, room to grow. That sounds wise." They spent the next hour walking the site together, and Caleb sketched rough plans in the dirt with a stick, showing her how he envisioned the walls rising from the granite foundation, how they could position the building to take advantage of the natural windbreak provided by the trees while still capturing the southern sun. Eleanor asked intelligent questions and offered her own observations, and Caleb found himself relaxing into the conversation, enjoying the give and take of planning something with someone who was genuinely interested. "I should start quarrying today," Caleb said finally, straightening from the sketch. "The sooner I start hauling stone, the sooner we have walls. It is going to take time, more time than building with lumber would take, but the result will be worth it." "How long?" Eleanor asked. "Roughly," Caleb calculated, factoring in the amount of stone needed, the time to quarry and shape each piece, the hauling distances, and his own physical limits. "If I work steady, probably 8 to 10 weeks, maybe longer if we get early storms, but I can get the walls up and a temporary roof in place before the first heavy snows. Then we can finish the interior work over the winter if needed." Eleanor looked out over the valley, her expression unreadable. 8 weeks. That is a long time for you to be working on something that benefits only me." "I offered," Caleb reminded her, "and I keep my word. Every stone I place will be a vow I am keeping, a vow that you will have walls that stand, that keep out the wind and the cold and whatever else this country throws at you." She turned to look at him then, really look at him, her gray-green eyes searching his face with an intensity that made him feel stripped bare, as if she could see past the muscle and bone to whatever lived underneath. "Why?" she asked softly. "You still have not told me why. And please do not say it is because you have nothing else to do. Men like you always have somewhere else to be." Caleb met her gaze and told her the truth, or as much of the truth as he understood himself. "I have spent 15 years in these mountains, since I was 17 years old. I've trapped beaver until they were nearly gone, hunted elk and deer and bear, traded with the crow and the blackfeet, survived winters that killed stronger men. I've been alone because that was easier, because people are complicated and the mountains are simple. But simple is not the same as good, and alone is not the same as free. When I saw you yesterday, refusing to bend even when bending might have been smarter, I saw something I recognized. Stubbornness, maybe. Or courage, or just the refusal to let this country win. And I thought maybe I could help with that. Maybe I could build something that lasts instead of just surviving season to season." Eleanor's eyes were bright, and he thought he saw the sheen of tears before she blinked and looked away. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion she was clearly trying to control. "Thank you. I do not know what else to say except thank you, and that seems inadequate. But it is all I have." "It is enough," Caleb said simply. "Now, do you have anything to eat? Because I am going to need fuel if I am going to start hauling stone, and that chicory coffee is not going to sustain me." Eleanor laughed, the sound surprised and genuine, and Caleb felt something warm unfold in his chest at the sound of it. "I have sourdough bread and some bacon. Will that do?" "That will do fine." They ate together sitting on a fallen log near Eleanor's tent, and Caleb learned that she had been a school teacher in Ohio before her father dragged her west, that she could read Latin and do mathematics and play the piano, none of which were particularly useful skills on a Montana ridge, but all of which suggested a mind that needed more than just survival to thrive. Eleanor learned that Caleb had been orphaned young, that he had lied about his age to join a trapping expedition at 15, that he had learned to survive in the wilderness, because the alternative was dying, and he had been too stubborn to die. "Stubbornness seems to be a theme with both of us," Eleanor observed, tearing off a piece of bread. "It is the most useful trait in the mountains," Caleb agreed. "Stubbornness and the sense to know when you are beaten." "And which of us has that sense?" Eleanor asked with a slight smile. "Neither of us, apparently, or you would not be living in a tent on a ridge. And I would not be promising to haul several tons of stone up a mountain." They finished eating, and Caleb gathered his tools and walked to the nearest granite outcropping. The stone here was good, weathered enough to have natural fracture lines, but solid enough to provide stable building blocks. He set to work with hammer and chisel, the rhythmic ring of metal on stone filling the clear mountain air. The first stone he quarried was roughly rectangular, about 30 pounds, its surface already shaped by centuries of freeze and thaw cycles. Caleb lifted it, felt the weight settle across his shoulders, and began the climb to where the cabin foundation waited. The distance was perhaps 200 yards, but the terrain was uneven, rocky and treacherous with loose scree and hidden roots. His muscles burned with the effort, his breathing hard in the thin mountain air. When he reached the foundation, he set the stone carefully in place, positioning it at the corner where the new walls would begin. The stone sat solid and true, catching the afternoon sunlight, and Caleb rested his hand on the rough granite surface. "First one," he said softly, to himself or to Eleanor, or to the mountain itself, he was not entirely sure. First vow kept. He turned and walked back down to the outcropping and began working on the next stone. By the time the sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Caleb had hauled 30 stones to the foundation. His shoulders ached, his back screamed, and his hands were raw despite the calluses. But 30 stones sat in neat rows, waiting to become walls, and that felt like progress. If Eleanor had not been idle, she had cleared the remaining debris from the old cabin, sorted through the ashes for anything salvageable, and started a fire in a stone ring she had constructed near her tent. When Caleb finally stopped working, she handed him a tin plate with beans and cornbread and more of that terrible, wonderful coffee. "You worked like a man possessed," she said, settling onto the log beside him with her own plate. "Just a man who made a promise," Caleb corrected, shoveling beans into his mouth and nearly moaning at how good they tasted after a day of hard labor. They ate in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge, the Milky Way, a river of light across the darkening sky. The night sounds of the forest rose around them, the hoot of an owl, the distant yip of coyotes, the rustle of wind through pine needles. It was a wild symphony, and Caleb had always found it more beautiful than any music performed in concert halls. "Where will you sleep?" Eleanor asked suddenly, and Caleb heard the worry in her voice, the awareness that she was the only woman for miles, and he was a man she barely knew, and the darkness changed the mathematics of trust. "I have a bedroll," Caleb said, understanding the question beneath the question. "I will sleep by the fire, or up in the trees if you prefer. Wherever makes you comfortable." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then shook her head. "By the fire is fine. I trust you, Mr. Brennan. I do not know why exactly, but I do." "Caleb," he said, "just Caleb, and I am glad for your trust. I will not betray it." "Eleanor," she responded, "just Eleanor, not Miss Hartwell, not ma'am. If we are going to be working together for the next 2 months, we should at least be on first-name terms." Caleb smiled in the darkness, liking the way she said working together, as if this was a partnership rather than charity. "Agreed, Eleanor." That night Caleb lay in his bedroll near the fire, staring up at the infinite stars and listening to the quiet sounds of Eleanor sleeping in her tent. He thought about the stones he had hauled, the walls that would rise, the promise he had made. He thought about gray-green eyes and auburn hair, and a stubbornness that matched his own. And he thought that maybe, just maybe, he had stumbled into something that looked a lot like purpose. The days fell into a rhythm as steady as the ring of hammer on chisel. Caleb woke before dawn, kindled the fire, and ate a quick breakfast of whatever Eleanor provided. Then he walked to the granite outcroppings and began quarrying stone, his muscles settling into the familiar burn of hard labor. Each stone had to be evaluated, tested for flaws and fractures, then carefully separated from the bedrock using hammer and chisel and wedges. Some stones split perfectly, revealing smooth faces that would fit together like puzzle pieces. Others were stubborn, requiring hours of work only to crack in the wrong direction and become useless for building. The good stones, the ones that would become walls, Caleb hauled to the foundation. One by one, 30 pounds at a time, he carried the mountain to Eleanor. Each trip up that slope was a promise renewed. Each stone placed was a vow kept. His body adapted to the work. And his already considerable strength increasing as his muscles learned the specific demands of this task. His shoulders broadened further, his back strengthened, his legs became iron from climbing the uneven terrain hundreds of times each day. Eleanor worked alongside him in her own way. She mixed mortar from clay she dug from a stream bed half a mile away, sand carried in buckets, and lime she had purchased in Copper Creek with the last of her money. She organized the stones Caleb brought, sorting them by size and shape, creating an inventory that would make the actual building process more efficient. She cooked meals that were simple but nourishing, stretching her limited supplies with wild plants she foraged from the forest and fish she caught in the creek. They talked while they worked, with conversations that ranged from the practical to the philosophical. Caleb learned that Eleanor had loved teaching, had missed it terribly when her father brought her west, that she dreamed of someday opening a school in Copper Creek if the settlement grew large enough to support one. Eleanor learned that Caleb could read, though he rarely did, that he spoke some Crow and a bit of Blackfoot, that he had once spent an entire winter snowed in at a remote cabin with nothing but a trapping partner who played the harmonica badly, and the experience had taught him the value of solitude. "But you do not seem like someone who dislikes people," Eleanor observed one afternoon. They were taking a break from work, sitting in the shade of a pine tree and sharing a canteen of cool water. "You talk easily enough, but you are patient with me when I ask questions." Caleb considered this, watching the way the sunlight filtered through the needles above them, creating patterns of light and shadow on Eleanor's face. "I do not dislike people. I just find them exhausting. The constant talking, the politics, the need to maintain appearances and navigate social expectations. In the mountains, things are simpler. You work, you survive, you appreciate the moments of beauty when they come. No one expects you to be anything other than what you are." "And what are you?" Eleanor asked softly. Caleb met her eyes, saw genuine curiosity there rather than judgment. "Just a man who knows how to endure. Nothing special." "I think you are wrong," Eleanor said. "I think you are someone who keeps promises even when they are difficult. Well, someone who builds when others would just walk away. That seems fairly special to me." Caleb felt heat rise in his face, unused to direct praise, unsure how to receive it. "You give me too much credit." "I do not think so, but I will let you believe that if it makes you more comfortable." She smiled at him, and Caleb felt his heart do something complicated in his chest, something that felt dangerous and exhilarating at the same time. He was falling for her, he realized, falling for her determination and her intelligence and the way she refused to let circumstances define her, falling for the sound of her laugh when he told stories about his misadventures in the wilderness, falling for the way she looked in the morning light with her hair down, brushing it before pinning it up for the day, the unaware that he was watching from his bedroll and feeling like an intruder on a private moment. It was dangerous to fall for someone when you were building her walls, when the power dynamic was so obviously unbalanced. She needed him, and need could look a lot like affection, when the only other option was solitude. Caleb told himself to be careful, to keep his distance, to remember that he was here to keep a promise, not to court a woman who deserved better than a mountain man with nothing to offer except strong shoulders and a stubborn refusal to quit. But keeping that distance became harder as the days stretched into weeks and the walls began to rise. The foundation was complete by the end of the second week, a solid base of granite sunk deep into the ground and built up level using careful measurements and Eleanor's surprising facility with mathematics. They celebrated that milestone with a meal of roasted grouse that Caleb had snared and wild onions that Eleanor had found growing near the creek, and they ate sitting on the foundation itself, imagining the walls that would soon surround them. "When my father and I first came here, I thought I would hate it," Eleanor said, her voice thoughtful in the gathering dusk. "I missed Ohio, missed my friends and my school and the library. I missed being able to walk down a street and see other people, to attend church services and quilting bees and all the ordinary social events that make up a life. This seemed like exile. Like I was being punished for something I had not done." "But you stayed," Caleb said. "Even after he died, you stayed." "Yes, because somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing it as exile and started seeing it as possibility. In Ohio, I was always going to be the school teacher, the spinster, the woman people pitied because she never married. Here, I can be anything. I can build a life on my own terms. I can wake up to this view every morning and know that I earned it through my own effort. That matters to me more than I can properly express." Caleb understood that in his bones, the need to earn your place through your own labor, to answer to no one except yourself and the land. "You are not a spinster. You are young." Eleanor laughed, but there was an edge to it. "I am 23, Caleb. In Ohio. That was practically ancient for an unmarried woman. I had received exactly one serious proposal from a widower with 5 children who needed a housekeeper more than he needed a wife. I declined, and the town acted as if I had committed some sort of social suicide." "Their loss," Caleb said firmly. "Anyone who could not see your worth was a fool." Eleanor turned to look at him, and the intensity in her gaze made Caleb's breath catch. "And what do you see, Caleb Brennan? When you look at me, what do you see?" It was a loaded question, heavy with implications, and Caleb knew that his answer mattered more than any stone he had hauled or any wall he would build. He could deflect, could make a joke, could keep his true feelings hidden behind the safe walls of casual friendship. Or he could take a risk. Lot could step out onto ground that might not hold his weight, could tell her the truth that had been growing in his chest since the moment he first saw her refusing to bend in front of that merchant. "I see someone who is stronger than she knows," Caleb said slowly, choosing his words with care. "Someone who lost everything but refused to surrender. Someone who makes terrible coffee and tells terrible jokes, and somehow makes this ridge feel less lonely. I see someone I am glad to build walls for, because I know those walls will protect something worth protecting." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken things, and Caleb watched Eleanor's face, trying to read her reaction, wondering if he had said too much or not enough or the wrong thing entirely. Then Eleanor did something completely unexpected. She leaned over and kissed him. A brief press of lips that tasted like wild onions and wood smoke and something sweeter underneath. Something that might have been hope. When she pulled back, her cheeks were flushed and her eyes were wide, as if she had surprised herself as much as she had surprised him. "I am sorry," she said quickly. "That was forward of me. I should not have." "Do not be sorry," Caleb said, his voice rougher than he intended, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Not for that. Never for that. I just wanted you to know," Eleanor continued, the words tumbling out in a rush, "that when I look at you, I see someone who showed up when no one else would, someone who works until his hands bleed and never complains, someone who tells me stories about grizzly bears and frozen rivers and makes me laugh even when I want to cry from exhaustion. I see someone I would very much like to kiss again, if you are amenable to that." Caleb reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his scarred, calloused hand. Her skin was soft against his palm, warm and alive, and when she leaned into his touch, he felt something in him unclench, some tight knot of loneliness he had carried for so long he had forgotten it was there. "I am very amenable to that," he said, and then he kissed her properly, taking his time, pouring into that kiss all the things he was not good at saying with words. He kissed her like she was precious, like she was the answer to questions he had not known he was asking, like she was home after 15 years of wandering. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Eleanor rested her forehead against his chest, and Caleb wrapped his arms around her, careful of his strength, aware of how fragile she felt against his bulk. "This is not practical," Eleanor said, her voice muffled against his shirt. "I have nothing to offer you except a half-built house and a questionable future." "I have less than that," Caleb countered. "I have a mule, some traps, and a reputation for avoiding civilization. But I have hands that work and a back that is strong, and I am very good at surviving. We could survive together if you wanted." Eleanor tilted her head back to look up at him, and Caleb saw his own feelings reflected in her eyes, that mix of terror and exhilaration that came from standing on the edge of something new and unknown. "I would like that," she said. "I would like that very much." They stayed there on the foundation as the stars emerged, holding each other, talking quietly about possibilities and futures, and what it might mean to build a life together in this wild place. It was not a proposal, not exactly, but it felt like something just as binding, a promise made between two people who understood that love in the wilderness required different things than love in settled places. It required trust and work and a willingness to face whatever came together, whether that was blizzards or bears, or simply the daily challenge of coaxing life from reluctant ground. The next morning, Caleb woke before dawn as usual, but this time when he emerged from his bedroll, Eleanor was already awake, sitting by the fire with 2 cups of that terrible coffee waiting. She smiled at him, shy and pleased, and Caleb felt his heart turn over in his chest. "Good morning," she said. Good morning," Caleb replied, accepting the coffee and sitting beside her close enough that their shoulders touched. They watched the sun rise over the mountains together, turning the peaks gold and pink and orange, and Caleb thought that he had seen 1,000 sunrises in his life, but this one mattered more than all the others combined. Then he stood, rolled his shoulders to loosen tight muscles, and walked down to the granite outcropping to quarry more stone. The walls were waiting, and he had vows to keep. The walls rose, slowly but steadily, course by course, stone by stone. Caleb developed a system, working in sections rather than trying to build all 4 walls simultaneously. He started with the back wall, the one that would take the brunt of the winter winds, and built it thick and strong. That each stone carefully selected and placed with mortar that Eleanor mixed to increasingly precise consistency. She had a gift for it, understanding instinctively how much water to add, how long to work the mixture when it was ready to use. They worked well together, falling into an easy rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Caleb would place a stone, and Eleanor would pack mortar around it, her smaller hands better suited to getting into tight spaces and ensuring there were no gaps where wind could penetrate. They did not always talk while they worked. Sometimes the labor itself was conversation enough, the back and forth of passing tools, the shared satisfaction of seeing a section of wall completed. But sometimes they did talk, and those conversations revealed more about each other than either had expected. Eleanor told him about her mother, who had died of consumption, about the long months of watching her waste away, about the guilt of feeling relieved when it was finally over. Caleb told her about his parents, killed when a riverboat boiler exploded, about being 12 years old and suddenly alone in St. Louis with no family and no prospects, about learning to survive on the streets before escaping into the wilderness, because the wilderness at least was honest about its dangers. "We are both orphans then," Eleanor said one afternoon, pressing mortar into a seam with her fingers. "Both alone in the world." "Not alone anymore," Caleb said, settling another stone into place, feeling it lock perfectly with its neighbors. Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes bright with emotion. "No, not alone anymore." The town of Copper Creek was not unaware of what was happening on the ridge. News traveled in small settlements, carried by trappers and traders and curious prospectors who wandered into the high country looking for new claims. Word spread that the mountain man Caleb Brennan was building stone walls for Eleanor Hartwell, that they were living together on her claim, that something was developing between them that was nobody's business but theirs, except that everything was everybody's business in a town that small. Caleb made supply runs to Copper Creek every 2 weeks, and he could feel the speculation in the looks people gave him, hear it in the careful questions they asked. Were he and Miss Hartwell planning to marry? Was the mountain man going to settle down? What would happen when winter came and the work was done? Caleb ignored most of it, but there were some questions that needed answering, particularly when Thornton the merchant made an appearance one afternoon at the ridge, huffing and puffing from the climb, his face red with exertion and self-importance. "I came to check on Miss Hartwell," Thornton announced, as if he had any right or reason to do so. "Make sure she's being properly looked after." Caleb was hauling stone when Thornton arrived, his shirt off in the summer heat, sweat running down his back and chest, his muscles standing out in sharp relief under sun-darkened skin. He set down the stone he was carrying and faced the merchant, aware that he probably looked more like a savage than a civilized man, his hair loose and wild, his hands covered in rock dust and mortar. "Miss Hartwell is fine, as you can see for yourself," Caleb said evenly, nodding to where Eleanor was working on the mortar mix, her sleeves rolled up and her face set in concentration. Thornton looked past Caleb to where the walls were rising, now chest high on the back and beginning to take recognizable shape. His expression was sour, as if the evidence of Caleb's labor was a personal insult. "I still say this is foolishness, stone walls in the middle of nowhere, for a woman alone. What happens when you finish, Brennan? You just going to wander off and leave her here?" Eleanor straightened from her work, and Caleb saw the anger flash in her eyes. "Mr. Thornton, I appreciate your concern, though I do not recall asking for it. My arrangements with Mr. Brennan are my own business. He has been nothing but honorable. And these walls are going to stand long after your overpriced lumber has rotted away." Thornton's face reddened further. "I'm simply thinking of your reputation, Miss Hartwell. A young woman and a man, living together unchaperoned out here. People talk." "Let them talk," Eleanor said sharply. "I'm more concerned with surviving the winter than with satisfying the gossip requirements of people who have never once offered to help me." Caleb felt a surge of pride at her words, at the steel in her spine. But he also knew that Thornton had a point, however badly he was making it. Reputation mattered, especially for a woman, especially in a place where social standing could mean the difference between acceptance and exile. "If it eases anyone's mind," Caleb said slowly, the words forming as he spoke them. It not entirely planned, but feeling right nonetheless. "Eleanor and I are planning to marry. Soon as the walls are finished and we can get to a preacher, so any talk about impropriety can stop right now." The silence that followed was profound. Thornton's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. Eleanor's eyes went wide, and Caleb could not quite read her expression, did not know if he had just done something wonderful or made a terrible mistake. "Is that so?" Thornton finally managed. "Well, that does change things, I suppose." "Yes, it does," Caleb said firmly, holding the merchant's gaze until Thornton looked away. Thornton muttered something about congratulations and needing to get back to town, then retreated down the trail with as much dignity as he could muster, which was not much. Caleb watched him go. He then slowly turned to face Eleanor, trying to read her reaction. She stood motionless, mortar-covered hands held out from her sides, her expression frozen somewhere between shock and something that might have been joy. "Eleanor," Caleb started, suddenly aware of how presumptuous he had been. "I am sorry. I should not have said that without asking you first. He made me angry, and the words came out, and I meant them, but I should have asked." Eleanor crossed the distance between them in quick strides and threw her arms around his neck, nearly knocking him backward with the force of her embrace. "Yes," she said against his shoulder. "Yes, you foolish, wonderful man. Yes." Caleb wrapped his arms around her, relief flooding through him so strongly his knees nearly buckled. "Yes? Mark, you're sure?" Eleanor pulled back just enough to look up at him, her eyes shining with tears that she did not bother to hide. "I am sure. I have been sure since you hauled the first stone up this ridge. I just did not know how to say it, did not want to presume. But yes, Caleb Brennan, I will marry you. I will marry you as soon as you finish building our walls." "Our walls," Caleb repeated, liking the sound of that, the way it transformed the promise from something he was doing for her into something they were building together. "Our walls," Eleanor confirmed. Then she kissed him, right there in the afternoon sun with mortar on her hands and rock dust in her hair, and Caleb kissed her back, tasting salt tears and coffee and the bright edge of laughter. They were married 6 weeks later in Copper Creek's small church, a simple ceremony attended by the handful of townspeople who had decided that a mountain man building stone walls for his woman was romantic rather than scandalous. Eleanor wore a dress borrowed from the blacksmith's wife, pale blue calico that had been altered to fit her slender frame. Caleb wore his cleanest buckskin shirt and pants, his hair trimmed and tied back, his beard neatened as much as it ever got. The preacher, a Methodist circuit rider named Collins, who made the rounds through the Montana settlements, performed the ceremony with enthusiasm, clearly pleased to be marrying a couple who actually seemed to want to be married rather than being forced into it by circumstance or scandal. When he pronounced them husband and wife, and Caleb kissed Eleanor in front of God and the assembled witnesses, there was genuine applause and even some cheering from the back pews. They spent their wedding night in a room above the general store that Thornton rented out to travelers, a small space with a real bed and clean sheets that felt luxurious after weeks of sleeping on the ground. Caleb was gentle with Eleanor, aware that for all her strength and independence, she was innocent in the ways of physical love. They learned each other slowly, with hands and mouths and whispered words, and when they finally came together fully, it was with a tenderness that made Eleanor cry, and Caleb hold her so tightly he worried he might break her. "I love you," Eleanor said afterward, lying in his arms, her head on his chest where she could hear his heart beating. "I know we have not said it yet, but I do. I love you." "I love you too," Caleb said, as the words feeling strange in his mouth because he had never said them before, not to anyone, had not even been sure he was capable of such feeling. But he was sure now. "I love you, Eleanor Brennan." She smiled at the sound of her new name, then tilted her head up to kiss him again. "Say it again." "Eleanor Brennan," Caleb repeated obediently. "My wife." "Your wife," Eleanor agreed, and the wonder in her voice matched what Caleb felt in his own chest, the amazement that two people who had been alone could find each other in the middle of wilderness and build something worth keeping. They returned to the ridge the next morning, back to the half-finished walls and the work that still waited. But now they returned as husband and wife, and that changed everything and nothing at the same time. The work was still hard, the stones still heavy, the days still long. But now when Caleb placed each stone, he was building walls for his wife, for their home, for the life they were creating together. The walls reached their full height by mid-August, 8 feet of solid granite that enclosed a space roughly 16 feet by 20 feet, large enough for a proper living area, with room for a bed, a table, storage, and Eleanor's precious books that had survived the fire because they had been in the tent with her that night. The walls were thick and straight and absolutely solid, the mortar joints tight, the cornerstones interlocked with precision. Caleb stood back and surveyed his work with satisfaction, Eleanor beside him, her hand in his. "It is beautiful," Eleanor said softly. "Caleb, it is truly beautiful." "It is walls," Caleb said. But he felt pride warm his chest because she was right. It was beautiful in its own way, beautiful in its solidity and strength, in the way it transformed raw mountain granite into shelter. The roof was the next challenge. Timber was still expensive, but Caleb had saved money from selling his furs, and Eleanor had a small amount put aside from her father's supplies. Together they had enough to purchase the necessary beams and boards from Thornton, who was now uncomfortably polite in his dealings with them, as if trying to make up for his earlier attitude. Caleb spent 2 days hauling timber up to the ridge, and then he and Eleanor worked together to frame the roof, setting massive beams across the stone walls and then laying boards across the beams. It was skilled work, requiring careful measurement and planning, but Caleb had helped build enough cabins in his years to know what he was doing. Eleanor proved surprisingly adept at carpentry, handling the saw with confidence and driving nails straight and true. They covered the roof boards with split cedar shingles that Caleb made himself, sitting outside in the evenings and splitting cedar logs into thin, uniform pieces that would overlap and shed water. It was tedious work, but Eleanor sat with him, helping to trim and shape the shingles, and they talked about the future, about what crops might grow in this harsh climate, about whether they might eventually expand the house, add another room for children if children came. "Do you want children?" Eleanor asked one evening, her hands busy with a shingle, her voice carefully casual. Caleb looked up from his work, considering the question seriously. But he had never thought much about children, had assumed that his life in the mountains precluded that kind of future. But now, with Eleanor beside him and walls rising around them, the idea did not seem impossible. "Yes," he said slowly. "I think I do. If you do." Eleanor smiled, and there was something in that smile that made Caleb's heart skip. "I do, though perhaps not immediately. I would like some time to just be us first, if that is acceptable." "That is more than acceptable," Caleb assured her, reaching over to take her hand. "We have time. We have all the time we need." The roof was finished by the 1st of September, and they celebrated by sleeping inside their house for the first time, lying on blankets spread over the packed earth floor, staring up at the underside of the roof they had built together. It was dim inside even during the day, the only light coming from the door opening and the windows Caleb had left in the walls, spaces that would eventually need glass or at least oiled paper to keep out the weather. But it was shelter, real shelter, and it was theirs. "We did it," Eleanor whispered in the darkness, her body warm against Caleb's side. "We actually did it." "You doubted?" Caleb asked, amused. "Every single day," Eleanor admitted. "I kept thinking something would go wrong, that you would get hurt, or I would run out of supplies, or a storm would destroy everything we had built. But we did it anyway." "We did it anyway," Caleb agreed, pulling her closer, "because we are too stubborn to fail." Eleanor laughed softly, and Caleb felt her relax against him, felt the tension drain out of her body as she finally let herself believe that they were safe, that they had succeeded, that the walls would hold. The interior work consumed September and October. Caleb built a wooden floor over the packed earth, laying planks carefully to create a level surface that would be warmer and drier than bare ground. He constructed a bed frame and a table and chairs, using timber he cut from the forest surrounding the ridge, seasoned pine that he shaped with an adze and smoothed with a plane. Eleanor sewed curtains for the windows from fabric she bought in Copper Creek, cheerful red gingham that brightened the stone walls. She made a mattress from canvas stuffed with dried grass and pine needles, not as comfortable as the feather tick she had left behind in Ohio, but serviceable and clean. They whitewashed the interior walls with lime, and the bright white surface reflected light, making the space feel larger and less like a cave. Eleanor hung her few possessions, a small mirror, a daguerreotype of her parents, a framed sampler her mother had embroidered. Caleb contributed his rifle, hung over the door on wooden pegs, and a bearskin rug he had kept from his trapping days, thick fur that made a warm spot in front of the fireplace. The fireplace was the heart of the home, the stone chimney from the old cabin incorporated into the new walls, the firebox rebuilt and enlarged. Caleb lined it with fire brick he hauled up from Copper Creek, making it safe and efficient. When he lit the first fire in early October, testing the draw and making sure the smoke vented properly, Eleanor stood beside him and watched the flames catch and grow, her face glowing in the firelight. "It works," she said, as if she'd not quite believed it would. "Of course it works," Caleb said, though he had been holding his breath too, worried that some flaw in the construction would send smoke billowing into the house instead of up the chimney. The fire burned clean and hot, warming the space quickly, and Caleb felt something settle in his chest, a deep satisfaction that came from creating something functional and good. These walls would keep Eleanor warm. This roof would keep her dry. This fireplace would cook her food and provide light and heat through the long winter months. Every vow he had made, every promise he had spoken or left unspoken, was manifested in stone and timber and mortar. They were as ready as they could be when the first snow came in late October, fat flakes falling silently from a gray sky, covering the ridge in white. Eleanor stood at the window, watching the snow accumulate, and Caleb came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on the top of her head. "Are you frightened?" he asked softly. "No," Eleanor said, and he could hear the truth in her voice. "I have you, and I have walls that will stand. What is there to be frightened of?" Caleb held her tighter, moved beyond words by her faith in him, in what they had built together. "Nothing," he said finally. "There is nothing to be frightened of. We will endure. We will thrive, I promise you that." "I know," Eleanor said simply, leaning back against his strength. "I believe every promise you make." The winter was hard, as Montana winters always were. Snow piled 6 feet deep around the stone walls, and the temperature dropped so low that water froze in the bucket overnight despite being inside near the fire. Wind howled down from the high peaks, battering the ridge with a fury that would have torn apart a timber cabin, but the stone walls stood firm, holding back the cold and wind, the mortar joints sealed tight against any intrusion. Inside, Caleb and Eleanor created a life together. They played cards by firelight, games of whist and poker that Eleanor had learned from her father and Caleb had learned from trappers in winter camps. They read aloud from Eleanor's books, stories by Dickens and Poe and Hawthorne. And Caleb discovered that he enjoyed hearing the sound of Eleanor's voice shaping words on a page, bringing stories to life in their stone sanctuary. They made love frequently, learning each other's bodies with the patient thoroughness that came from having all the time in the world and nowhere else to be. Eleanor lost her shyness, becoming bold in expressing what she wanted, and Caleb discovered that pleasing her gave him satisfaction deeper than anything he had experienced before. They were partners in this too, equals in giving and receiving pleasure, and the intimacy of those winter nights bound them together more tightly than any vow spoken in a church. By January, Eleanor suspected she was pregnant. She did not say anything immediately, wanting to be sure, but Caleb noticed the changes, the way she felt nauseated in the mornings, and the way her body was subtly different when he held her. Finally, one evening as they sat by the fire with snow hissing against the windows, Eleanor took his hand and placed it on her still flat belly. "There is a baby coming," she said quietly. "Sometime in the summer, I think. Are you pleased?" Caleb stared at their joined hands, trying to process what she had just told him. A baby, their baby. A new life created in this stone house, in this wild place, from the love they had built alongside the walls. "Pleased," he managed finally. "Eleanor, I am terrified and thrilled and more pleased than I have words for. Are you well? Is everything as it should be?" Eleanor smiled at his concern, lifting his hand to kiss his scarred knuckles. I am well. Tired and sick in the mornings, but that is normal. We will need to prepare, build a cradle, make sure we have supplies for when the time comes. But we have months. We have time. We have time, Caleb repeated, then pulled Eleanor into his lap and held her, feeling the miracle of it, that two people who had been alone could create something entirely new, a future that extended beyond themselves. The rest of that winter was spent in preparation. Caleb built a cradle from pine, rocking it on curved runners, making it sturdy and safe. Eleanor sewed baby clothes from fabric she'd been saving, tiny gowns and blankets and caps that seemed impossibly small when Caleb held them in his big hands. They talked about names, about what kind of parents they wanted to be, about how to raise a child in this wild place where the nearest neighbor was miles away and the nearest school even farther. I can teach him, Eleanor said, with her hands resting on her growing belly. Or her, reading and mathematics and history, everything I know. And I will teach them to survive, Caleb added, how to read weather, how to track game, how to respect the land and take only what is needed. Between the two of us, they will be well educated in what matters, Eleanor said with satisfaction. The snow began to melt in April, revealing the winter-dead grass and the still-frozen ground beneath. Caleb ventured out as soon as the trails were passable, checking his trap lines that he had neglected for months, hunting for fresh meat to supplement their dwindling supplies. The world outside the stone walls was waking up, and Caleb felt himself waking too, emerging from the cocoon of winter with renewed energy. Eleanor was visibly pregnant now, her belly round under her dresses, though her movements slower and more careful. Caleb watched her with a mix of awe and concern, this woman who had been slender and quick now carrying the weight of their child, her body transforming to accommodate the life growing inside her. She was beautiful to him, more beautiful than ever, and he told her so frequently, which always made her laugh and call him foolish. I am huge and ungainly, Eleanor protested one afternoon, struggling to reach her feet to put on her boots. You are beautiful and carrying my child, Caleb corrected, kneeling to help her with the boots. Nothing ungainly about that. You are biased. Absolutely, Caleb agreed cheerfully, completely, utterly biased, and correct. In June, Caleb rode down to Copper Creek to fetch the midwife, a sturdy woman named Martha, who had delivered most of the babies in the settlement and several in the surrounding wilderness. She agreed to come to the ridge when Eleanor's time came, though she warned that she would need payment and that Caleb would need to come get her when the labor started, no waiting until the last minute. Caleb paid her with furs and a promise of fresh venison, and Martha gave him a list of supplies to have ready, clean cloths and hot water and whiskey for pain if Eleanor needed it. Caleb committed the list to memory and bought everything he did not already have, storing it in the stone house in preparation for the day that was coming. That day arrived in late July during a thunderstorm that rolled down from the mountains with apocalyptic fury. Eleanor woke in the middle of the night with the first pains. Aaron Caleb dressed quickly and rode through the storm to Copper Creek, lightning splitting the sky and thunder shaking the ground beneath his horse's hooves. He fetched Martha and brought her back to the ridge, both of them soaked to the skin by the time they arrived. Martha took charge immediately, sending Caleb to boil water and then banishing him from the house when Eleanor's labor intensified. Caleb paced outside in the rain, useless and terrified, listening to Eleanor cry out and wishing there was something, anything he could do to help. He had faced grizzly bears and blizzards and hostile warriors, but nothing had prepared him for the helplessness of listening to the woman he loved in pain and being unable to do anything about it. The storm raged, and Eleanor labored, and Caleb wore a path in the mud outside their stone walls. Though praying to a God he was not sure he believed in, that Eleanor would be all right, that the baby would be all right, that he would not lose the family he had only just found. Dawn was breaking when Martha finally opened the door and called him inside. Caleb entered cautiously, his heart in his throat, and saw Eleanor propped up in their bed, exhausted and pale but smiling, a bundle of blankets cradled in her arms. "Come meet your son," Eleanor said softly. Caleb approached slowly, aware of his muddy boots and wet clothes, aware that he was crying and did not care. He knelt beside the bed and looked down at the tiny face emerging from the blankets, red and wrinkled and perfect, eyes squinted shut against the light. "A son," Caleb whispered, reaching out to touch one impossibly small hand. Tiny fingers closed around his scarred thumb, they gripping with surprising strength, and Caleb felt his heart break open, all the careful walls he had built around himself crumbling in the face of this overwhelming love. "We made this," Eleanor said, her voice full of wonder. "You and I, we made him." "You did all the hard work," Caleb said, unable to look away from his son's face. "You built the walls that kept us safe," Eleanor countered. "Every stone you placed was a promise. Now we have him because of those promises." Caleb leaned over and kissed Eleanor's forehead, tasting salt and tears. "Thank you," he said, inadequate words for the gift she had given him. "Thank you for him, for this, for everything." "Thank you for building walls that stand," Eleanor replied, "for keeping every vow." They named him James, after Eleanor's father, and he was a hungry baby who nursed well and slept poorly, keeping both parents awake through the summer nights. Caleb discovered that he was surprisingly competent with an infant, his big hands capable of changing napkins and soothing fussy crying. He walked the stone floor for hours with James against his shoulder, singing old trapping songs in his rough voice, stories of rivers and mountains and the wild places where he had spent his youth. Eleanor recovered slowly from the birth, her body needing time to heal, but she was strong and young and had been well fed through the pregnancy. By August, she was back to herself, though she complained that her dresses no longer fit properly, and that her body had betrayed her by becoming softer in places that had been hard. "You are beautiful," Caleb told her for the 1,000th time, unmeaning it more than ever. "You are obligated to say that," Eleanor said, but she smiled when she said it, pleased despite her protests. The years that followed were good ones, marked by the rhythms of mountain life and the growing family within the stone walls. James learned to walk, then to run, his first steps taken on the wooden floor Caleb had laid. He learned to talk, his first word, Papa, which made Caleb grin like an idiot for a week. Eleanor taught him his letters, and Caleb taught him to recognize animal tracks in the mud, to understand weather signs, to move quietly through the forest. When James was 3, Eleanor became pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to do. She delivered a daughter in the spring, a tiny girl with auburn hair like her mother and her father's pale blue eyes. They named her Catherine, and she was a serious, contemplative baby who watched everything with intense focus, as if cataloging the world for future reference. Caleb expanded the stone house, adding a second room built with the same care as the first, more walls hauled stone by stone up the ridge, more vows kept. The new room gave James his own space and would eventually house Catherine when she was old enough to need privacy. The stone walls enclosed them all, protecting and sheltering, solid and eternal. More children came in the years that followed. A second son, Daniel, who was wild and adventurous from the moment he could crawl. Another daughter, Mary, who was quiet like Catherine, but with Eleanor's stubborn independence. Each child was welcomed into the stone house, each one taught to read and write by Eleanor, taught to hunt and track by Caleb, to understand that they lived in a place that was both beautiful and unforgiving. The stone walls that Caleb had built became famous in their small way. People traveling through the region would detour to see them, marveling at the craftsmanship, at the sheer determination it must have taken to quarry and haul so much granite. Caleb would show them around if they asked politely, pointing out the interlocking corners, the precise mortar work, the way the walls were built to stand for generations. "Why did you do it?" someone would inevitably ask. "Why stone instead of timber?" And Caleb would look at Eleanor, usually nearby with a baby on her hip or a child clinging to her skirts, and he would say simply, "Because I promised her walls that would stand. Every rock I placed was a vow I kept." Eleanor would smile when he said that, the same smile she had given him on their wedding day, full of love and trust and the knowledge that some promises were more important than breath. The settlement of Copper Creek grew over the years, transforming from a rough mining camp into a proper town with a church and a school and even a newspaper that came out weekly when the editor was sober. Eleanor achieved her dream of teaching, opening a school in the town that operated during the winter months when the passes were snowed in and families were desperate for their children to have something productive to do. Caleb would drive her down to Copper Creek on Monday mornings and fetch her back on Friday afternoons. Bea and the children who attended her school learned not just reading and mathematics, but also kindness and curiosity, values that Eleanor modeled in everything she did. The years were not without hardship. There were winters so harsh that even the stone walls could not keep out all the cold when they burned through their entire wood supply, and Caleb had to venture into blizzards to cut more. There were summers when drought turned the grass brown and the creek ran low, when they worried about the garden and the animals. There was the year that James, at 15, broke his leg falling from a tree, and Caleb had to ride through the night to fetch the doctor, holding his son's hand while the bone was set and promising that the pain would pass. But there were more good times than bad. There were Christmas celebrations with the stone house decorated with pine boughs and wild holly, all 4 children singing carols while Eleanor played melodies on the dulcimer Caleb had traded for. There were summer evenings when the whole family would sit outside and watch the stars emerge, Caleb pointing out constellations and telling stories about the mountains. There were quiet mornings when Caleb and Eleanor would wake before the children and lie together in the bed he had built, talking softly about plans and dreams, still in love after all the years, still choosing each other every day. James grew tall and broad-shouldered like his father, though he had his mother's quick mind and love of learning. At 18, he announced that he wanted to go to university. "I'm to study engineering and return to Montana to help build railroads and bridges." Caleb and Eleanor had saved money from Eleanor's teaching and Caleb's guiding work, taking wealthy hunters into the high country for trophy elk and grizzly. They had enough to send James east, to a college in Boston that seemed impossibly far away, but would give him the education he craved. The day James left was hard for everyone, but especially for Eleanor, who cried in Caleb's arms that night and mourned the loss of her firstborn, even as she was proud of him for having the courage to pursue his dreams. "He will come back," Caleb promised her, holding her close. "These mountains are in his blood. He will come back." And James did come back 4 years later, with a degree in engineering and a wife he had met in Boston, a smart young woman named Sarah, who took one look at the stone walls and declared them the most romantic thing she had ever seen. James got work with the railroad company pushing lines into Montana, and he and Sarah built their own house in Copper Creek, timber and modern, but James made sure the foundation was stone, quarried from the same ridge where his father had built his mother's walls. Catherine became a teacher like her mother, taking over Eleanor's school when Eleanor decided she wanted to spend more time at home, writing and reading and enjoying the peace of the mountains. Daniel became a guide like his father, learning the high country until he knew every trail and pass, every hidden valley and secret meadow. Mary married a rancher from the valley and raised cattle on land that had once seemed too wild to support anything domestic. The years accumulated, and Caleb and Eleanor grew older together, their hair going gray, their faces gaining lines that told the story of a life lived fully. Caleb's shoulders stayed broad and strong despite his age, though he moved more carefully now, aware that his body did not recover from exertion the way it once had. Eleanor remained slender and sharp-minded, though she needed spectacles for reading and complained that her hands ached on cold mornings. They were sitting outside one summer evening, watching the sun set over the mountains they loved, when Eleanor reached over and took Caleb's hand. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" Caleb asked, though he thought he knew. "For building me walls. For keeping every promise. For giving me a life I never imagined I could have." Eleanor squeezed his hand, and Caleb felt the familiar warmth of her touch, as precious now as it had been 30 years ago. "You gave me the same thing," Caleb said. "Purpose, family, home. I was just surviving before I met you. You taught me how to live." "We taught each other," Eleanor corrected. "That is what partnerships do." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged, the same stars they had watched on their wedding night, the same stars they had pointed out to their children and would someday point out to grandchildren. The stone walls rose behind them, solid and enduring, exactly as Caleb had promised they would be. Those walls would stand for generations, sheltering Caleb and Eleanor's descendants, becoming part of the landscape. As permanent as the mountains themselves, and every stone in those walls was a kept vow, A promise made and fulfilled, a testament to what could be built when two stubborn people decided to face the wilderness together. The sun disappeared behind the peaks and the night settled over the ridge, soft and peaceful. Inside the stone house, candles flickered in the windows, warm light spilling out into the darkness. Caleb and Eleanor stood hand in hand and walked inside their home, closing the door behind them on another day, another memory, another piece of the life they had built together. Years later, when Caleb was 72 and Eleanor was 70, they sat in the stone house surrounded by grandchildren who climbed on Caleb's lap and begged for stories about mountain lions and winter storms. Eleanor would watch from her chair, knitting baby blankets for the latest great-grandchild, her face content and peaceful. "Tell us about the walls, grandfather," one of the grandchildren would ask, the same request made every visit. "Tell us how you built them." And Caleb would tell the story, how he had seen their grandmother standing in the street refusing to bend, how he had promised walls that would stand, how he had quarried and hauled stone until his back screamed and his hands bled, how every rock he placed was a vow he kept. "Why did you do it?" the grandchildren would ask. "Why work so hard?" And Caleb would look at Eleanor, his wife of nearly 50 years, the love of his life, the reason for everything, and he would say what he always said, because some promises are more important than comfort. Some vows are worth keeping no matter the cost. And when you find someone worth building walls for, you build them, stone by stone, until you have created something that will outlast you both. The grandchildren would nod solemnly, not quite understanding yet, but storing the words away for when they were older and had learned what love and commitment truly meant. Eleanor would catch Caleb's eye across the room and smile, that same smile that had captured his heart in Copper Creek so many years ago, and Caleb would smile back, grateful beyond measure for every stone, every vow, every moment of the life they had built together inside those walls. When Caleb finally passed, at the age of 78, it was peacefully in his sleep, Eleanor's hand in his, their bodies curved together in the bed he had built decades before. Eleanor followed him 6 months later, unable or unwilling to live long without her partner, and they were buried side by side on the ridge overlooking the valley, close to the stone walls that had sheltered their love. The house passed to their children, then to their grandchildren, each generation maintaining the stone walls with reverence, understanding that they were more than just shelter. They were a testament to love and determination, to promises kept and vows honored. They were proof that two people who started with nothing but stubbornness and hope could build something that would last forever. And on summer evenings, when the wind blew down from the high peaks and the sun painted the mountains gold, you could almost see them, Caleb and Eleanor, walking hand in hand around their stone walls, checking the mortar and admiring the craftsmanship, still together, still in love, still protected by the walls that a mountain man had built, stone by stone, vow by vow, for the woman who had taught him that some promises were worth keeping forever.